All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Houston Oasis. My name is Alexis, and I'll be the MC for today. We have got an awesome lineup for you today. We've got a community moment from world record holder for community moments, Lou Cana. We will take a short coffee break, and then we'll have part one of what seems to be a really interesting series that I've already gotten comments on that people are interested to hear. So we're looking forward to that talk from Schmitt. All right, our main talk today, it will be given by Schmitt. He is well known in our community, and his talk is very long, so I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce it, because as much as I like to think of myself as a smart person, this might be above my pay grade. So please welcome to the front, Schmitt.
Okay, so today I'm going to give you part one of a two-part talk. At a fast clip, it's going to take a full hour to get through this. So for questions, please either bring them up at lunch, or I noticed there's no community moment next week. Maybe we could entertain questions at that time. But I will be showing you a particle model of physics. And those can be hard to visualize. I actually brought physical models with me. I'll pull them out from time to time to show you. And you're welcome to come up at some point and take a look at them. Happy to go over those with you. Now, I want to read the introduction to you just because it's a bit longer than I can commit to memory. So in the space of these two presentations, I'm going to show you the product of several years of modeling the origin of the universe, its fundamental fields and particles. The model connects to all areas of particle physics. At its core is an equivalence that allows for the generation of fundamental building blocks. The foundation is encapsulated in the acronym DREAM, which stands for Dimensional Release of 8 Assembly Modules. Like most acronyms, it's a bit forced, but physics is all about force, so I suppose that's fine. Hopefully you'll find this a lucid dream. Some of you may recall that I gave a presentation to Oasis 8.5 years ago, where I proposed that all of the dimensions of string theory, were initially compacted as opposed to being subsequently compacted, and that three dimensions escaped, uncurled, and provided energy to form the universe from. Now, that's a sweeping and justified use of the matter energy equivalence. In late 2018, I learned that properties of matter like mass can be emergent, and I'll show you a clip that launched me on this journey. This prompted the idea of using a dimension as a fundamental building block. The idea that the particles of the standard model may be built from something more fundamental is not new. Fundamental building block has been variously named, but the term preon, P-R-E-O-N, has won out. The preon concept has appeal because it avoids the need to start from many particles with many properties. I selected a preon consisting of 3 orthogonal dimensions because I was trying to derive a 3D universe. I bought a pack of pipe cleaners and started building. I was initially agnostic that it could build anything reasonable. But the results were intriguing, if not flimsy and cumbersome. So I bought a connector kit, and with that, I built models to see where that would take me. As I did, I began to believe that at a minimum, the DREAM model would be useful for organizing information. As my efforts progressed, the DREAM model provided so many useful insights and answers to longstanding mysteries that I now think it may capture the essence of particle physics. So with the help of a physicist, I hope to turn this theory into a published model. Of course, these are audacious and precarious statements since I'm well outside of my area of expertise, which is genetics. I firmly believe that science should become public after passing peer review. While I would much prefer this work to first go through critical review and further development by a bona fide physicist, I'm concerned that that may be a very lengthy process. With little to lose, I've decided to publicly present my theory now in order to establish precedents. As with any theory, it should be rejected in whole or in part if elements of the theory do not hold up to scrutiny. And that's how science works and how truth wins out. While on the slides, I'll gloss over many technical details for reason of time and audience engagement. At a minimum, I hope that you will gain a framework for organizing concepts of fundamental particle physics. More than that, I hope you will see how an idea can produce a map to bigger things. I'm indebted to Gary Houle, Bob Fisher, who's on vacation, and Conrad Schmitt, my son, for review and discussion of drafts. Despite his ability to spot weaknesses, there is no truth to the rumor that I've financed Bob's vacation. I'm also grateful to the physicist Ding-Yu Chung, who kindly read my first draft many years ago and informed me that my model belonged to a grouping known as prion theories. That led me in many directions, which I will explore with you now. So now if someone could please turn off the photon generators, I'll get started. It may be a bit hard to see some of these slides. So if you're really into this, I would encourage you to move up to the front. And I hope you all had your coffee. You're going to need it. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to be off to the side here because I really need to point out a lot of features on these slides. So the audacious goals of this presentation are explain how the universe could have been born from nothing, explain the origins of space and time, explain why we live in a universe with 3 physical dimensions, explain how to build the particles that inhabit our universe, explain why there are 3 generations of what are called fermions, explain the various properties of those particles, explain the nature of the strong nuclear force, explain the nature of color charge and the residual strong nuclear force, explain the nature of the weak force, explain how neutrinos oscillate between their types, explain why some particles have mass and others do not, explain what fields are, explain what dark matter is, explain what dark energy may be, and explain where the value of the fine structure constant alpha comes from. Now, all of those are big claims, but I hope to convince you that there's a path through these, and it's just a matter of following the model. So you all have a copy of this. It's a standard model of particle physics. And let me just give you a quick guide to it. You'll want to refer to it from time to time during the talk. So modern physics really is not a particle physics theory. It's quantum field theory, where particles are actually seen as excitations in a field, and that particle interactions are actually interactions of these excitations between fields. But there are particles. I mean, when we look under a microscope, we see matter. And so I wanted to look at a particle aspect of this to see what insights it might provide. So over here, almost everything you know in the universe is made up of these: the up quark, the down quark, and the electron. This whole group is collectively known as the fermions. And so the quarks are here. First generation quarks are up and down. Second generation are called charm and strange. And the third are top and bottom. And then we have the electron, and then we've got cousins of the electron, heavier cousins, the muon and the tauon. And then there are also a lot of neutrinos in the universe, but they interact very poorly with matter. You've got just oodles and boodles of these moving through you every single moment of the day. And then aside from these particles, there are force carriers. So the gluon is what is the force carrier for the strong nuclear force. The photon is the force carrier for electromagnetic radiation. The W and Z bosons carry the weak nuclear force. And you probably all heard about the Higgs boson, which really isn't doing much of anything, but it's proof that there is such a thing as a Higgs field. And the Higgs field is what enables particles to have mass. Mass is increasing as we go left to right, and it's also, for the most part, increasing as we go top to bottom, with one exception right here. So there are properties of each of these particles. So we've got mass and charge and spin. So we can look at charge, for example. When you think of a proton, it is made of two up quarks and a down quark. Well, up quarks have a charge of plus 2/3, and down quarks have a charge of minus 1/3. So two up quarks makes 4/3 minus 1/3 here, gets you a charge of 1, which is what a proton has. For a neutron, it's uncharged. It's got two of the down quarks. So minus 2/3 plus an up quark plus 2/3. That totals to 0. You got a neutral particle. That's kind of how it works. So this model is going to have to explain not just, it's going to have to explain these properties: mass, charge, spin, and it turns out there's a bunch of other things that we're going to have to go over as well. So I already told you that people these days mainly focusing quantum field theory, not particle theory. Quantum field theory sees the particles as excitations in a field. I don't think that's quite right. I think actually there are independent particles of the fields. Yes, fields are real, and yes, fields generate particles. They are connected, but I see the particles as distinct entities, and hopefully that'll become clear to you why. Okay, fermions also have independent properties of helicity and chirality. So there are actually 4 forms of each of these fermions. We have both left and right helicity and left and right chirality at each of these points. So there's a lot more there than you think. Okay, so are we there yet? We've got this model. And the question becomes, why would the universe be built from so many parts with so many different quantum values and fields? Is there something more basic? Focus of fundamental physics has shifted from particles to quantum field theory due to its successes. Nonetheless, quantum field theory doesn't do some things. It's mute as to the origins of space and the many fields within it. Quantum field theory does not account for fundamental constants like the fine structure constant alpha. It's known that the standard model is incomplete. For example, it doesn't account for gravity. Physicists have long postulated that there may be additional fundamental components or building blocks. For example, does spin indicate a part missing from the standard model? Spin is strange. The fermions I show you has spin 1/2. And what that means is that if you turn around, if you're a fermion, you're only halfway there. You actually have to go 720 degrees to get back to start. Now, the bosons that are spin 1 are fine. They're like what you would expect. Turn them 360 degrees, you're back to where you start. The Higgs boson is spin 0. And what that means is that any movement at all is back to 0. So we've got this strange concept called spin. I'm going to hopefully make it clear to you what that is. Now, I'm going to talk about some general features of spin this week. I'll go into a lot more depth on it next week. So how do we know that there's spin? Well, there's this very famous experiment done called the Stern-Gerlach experiment. And what they did was they took silver atoms and sent a beam of silver atoms towards a detection plate. And why silver? Well, silver has 1 electron in its outer shell, and that determines its electromagnetic behavior. And so when they did this, they did not get an expected result of being a smear of all positions of the electron spin. They saw only up and only down. Now, if it was a spin 1 particle, they actually would have expected 3 spots. So it would have been a -1 position a 0, and a +1. So this is how they got to decide that there was a half spin for an electron. So how do you make half spin? Well, spinners are used to explain half spin. So the Mobius strip dates back to at least the 3rd century AD, shown here in the animation is an animation of an Escher illustration. And it's not an optical illusion. You can see these ants and follow them the whole way around this structure. And they go over and under. And what you'll note is for the ant to get back to where it started, it actually has to travel 720 degrees. By the time it goes 360 degrees, it's only gone from top to bottom. So the Mobius strip is a model for something called a Weil spinner, W-Y-E-L, but it's German. And here they've decorated it with arrows to show a direction on it. So arrowheads I've shown here as points, and then the feathered end I've shown as a plus sign. So those are the quills. And what you've got here is a superposition of states. So if you look behind this arrow, you've got the tail of the arrowhead, right? The tail of the arrow. So these things are superimposed across this structure. And as you go around, you'll go 360 degrees, and then you'll start in on this side. And then go another 360 degrees. So that makes 720, and then you're back to where you started, just like on the Mobius strip. So spinners were invoked in the 1920s to explain half spin of fermions, this weird property. And here's an example of a spinning object, and it's showing half spin. You actually have to go color-wise. I'm not sure you can appreciate it here, given the lighting, but to come back to start requires 720 degrees of rotation. And what's happening here, okay, here the green is going clockwise. After it does a rotation, half a rotation, 360 degrees, it's now going counterclockwise, and it keeps flipping between those. So how can we introduce a spinner to our fermions, or at least map them on a spinner? Well, one way to do that is string theory starts with closed loop strings. And if we take one of those and just fold it over into a figure 8, and then fold the top down onto the bottom, we get this structure. And what you'll see is that you actually have to go around twice to get back to where you started. So 2 points here map onto 1 point on a circle. So that gets us our 720 degree rotation. And there's this, unlike the Penrose triangle, spinners aren't optical illusions, they're real objects. But still, that got really twisted in 1967. But that was to be expected. Why did it get really twisted? This guy named Roger Penrose, who's a phenomenal mathematician, one of the greatest of all times, had combined 2 spinners, each spinner being 2 complex numbers, to produce a structure that I'm sorry you can't see very well here, but it's this big torus with a direction to it, and it's called a twister. So it turns out that Sir Roger Penrose is actually the son of Lionel Penrose, who was a psychiatrist who actually promoted the Penrose triangle. He didn't invent it, but he promoted it. So spinners come in different types. I already mentioned a Weil spinner. So it's a superposition of spin up and spin down states. It contains 2 complex numbers. So this would be a left Weil spinner. It's got left chirality with upspin and left chirality with downspin. You can also make it with chirality, and I'll show you what that means in a minute, You make right chiral up and spin down. A Dirac spinner is actually a combination of these two, if you add them together. So it actually has 4 complex numbers. So it's described by a wave function that covers both spin, superimposed spin, and also covers superimposed chiralities. Well, 4 complex numbers in one wave function sounds a lot like a twister. It makes you wonder if that's not the structure that we're dealing with. There are other types of spinners I'm only going to mention briefly. There's a Majorana spinner. The interesting thing about it is the way that the left and the right vial spinners are connected. The way they connect leaves the particle with no charge. And because of that, it is thought of as being possibly involved in production of neutrinos, which lack charge. There's also a spinner called Elko, and the only thing Elko interacts with is the Higgs field. So it doesn't interact with the other forces. That makes it dark. And so it's been considered as a candidate in models for dark matter. So, as I say, spinners apply both to matter and antimatter. So for matter, we've got a left and right vial spinner. Each of those vial spinners has superposition of up and down spin states. And we've got the same thing for antimatter. And I'll try and make it clear what makes something matter and what makes something antimatter. So let's look at chirality and helicity. So spinner or particle chirality is an intrinsic property. Chirality does not depend on your frame of reference. So if you look here, sorry, I lost my pointer. There it is. So here we're moving in this direction and we're spinning in this direction. Well, that's what your right hand does. Point your thumb in the direction of the spin. Your curl of your fingers show the direction of the spin. This is a left chiral particle. If we change the direction of motion, it now becomes a right chiral particle. So it is independent of point of view. Chirality is something that's baked into the particle. So your left hand and right hand are examples of a chiral pair. No matter how you look, a left hand is distinguishable from a right hand. Unlike chirality, helicity depends on an observer's frame of reference. So here, if we are moving in the direction of the arrow, if you look and you're spinning this way, if you looked at the blue face, you'd be going counterclockwise. If you looked at the gold face, you'd be going clockwise. And if you change your direction of motion, just the opposite happens. Here it would be clockwise movement. Here it would be counterclockwise movement. So helicity really depends on your direction of motion. So when I got into this, I had no idea that spinners were going to be so important, but it turns out that they tracked everywhere as I worked on things here. So I got into them because of the half spin, but it turns out they were connected to the electromagnetic field, to something called spin network, the fine structure constant alpha, particle charge, the weak force, mass, dark matter, and matter versus antimatter. We'll get through some of those today. So here's our part list that we need. And as I say, the models are over here for you to look at. These are hard to tell what's going on from a photo. But we're going to start with a closed loop string. What's a string? In string theory, a string is a dimension. And it's in a closed loop. And we're going to take that and we're going to fold it up into a spinner. And from that, we're going to build space. We're also going to trifold it, so that we have something that has orthogonal dimensions, like this. I picked this way because we're trying to build a 3D universe, and we're going to stick these together to see what we can build with them. Okay, so the first thing you build with them when you stick two of these together is going to be the photon, and I'll explain why in a minute. You put three of them together, you get the right number of structures to be the gluon colors. The gluons are the carriers in standard model of the strong force. I don't believe that's actually right. I'll show you why. And then when you put four of them together, you get precisely four products, just like there are four G1 fermions. So up, down, electron, and electron neutrino. It was the right number. And then if you assemble these further at 8, it's basically a dimer of these. You got four more structures. They look pretty different from everything else, and I'll show you why I believe those to be the gauge bosons. Now you'll remember on your sheet here, charge repeats across generation 1 to 2 to 3. These are all the same charge. And the second row are all the same charge, all different, but same charge. These are all charge -1, and these are all uncharged. Well, if these really are the G1 fermions, their structures are virtually identical. They all have a square. They just have these unbonded ends sticking off in different directions. That means that these half bond ends have to be determinants of charge. So that's what we're going to build. Okay, I just wanted to give you an introduction to it, and let's go through how we get there. So let's take a step back. What has to happen for there to be birthing of a universe? Space, time, the contents of space, that's the particles and fields, have to be generated. The initial conditions demand that the building blocks must be ephemeral. What are the initial conditions? Well, entropy is a measure of disorder, and entropy is increasing in the universe. So if you roll the clock backwards, prior to the Big Bang, entropy and particle entanglements should have been 0. So we got to have that in our model. By definition, and this is really profound, stop and think about this. By definition, the most fundamental building block, if we're going to find something really down at the bottom, the most fundamental building block cannot be built from anything else. It's the fundamental unit. And that means a couple things. It means that whatever is down there at the base has to bridge this chasm between nothingness, no universe, and something. It's going to have to be both at the same time. That's the key. And because all these particles we're going to create have various properties, these properties are going to need to be emergent. They are going to be self-realized as we build things. And I'll show you how that happens. So the emergence of properties actually is a clue that you could actually dial it back and get down to something more fundamental. Let's take a look at that. So you're actually already familiar with lots of emergent properties. We can go from particles to atoms to chemistry to molecules to biological processes to societies, and of course, taxes. I'm going to show you a short clip now that is what actually launched me on this journey, and it's about the emergence of mass. So this is from a program called Space Time, which I highly recommend to anybody interested in this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to show you a minute of it to give you an idea of how mass can be emergent.
inside the box in all directions. All of the walls of the box will feel the same pressure, so there's no overall force on the box. But let's give the box a little nudge, increase its velocity. Now the back wall of the box moves into the incoming photons. It feels a little more pressure from their impact than before. In the meantime, the front of the box, moving away from the incoming photons, feels less pressure. There's a net backwards force that feels like a resistance to the change in speed. The photons exert a force on the box, but the box also exerts a force on the photons, Newton's third law, which gives us conservation of momentum. Momentum lost by the box is transferred to the photons. Now if the box stops accelerating, then everything jiggles around and momentum gets shared out evenly between the box and the photons again. But as long as acceleration continues, the pressure differential persists. Acceleration is resisted in a way that feels exactly like mass. In fact, it's indistinguishable from mass because it is mass. The photon box is massive, even though none of its components, not the photons, not the walls, have any mass. Somehow, mass arises in the ensemble, where it doesn't exist in the parts. How much mass does the box have? It's the energy of the photons divided by the square of the speed of those photons. And you can derive the famous E equals mc squared just by looking at how momentum transfers between the photons and the box under acceleration. But E equals mc squared describes the universal relationship between mass and confined energy, not just confined photons. So let's look at another example of confined energy. A compressed spring holds more energy than a relaxed spring. It holds potential energy. So is a compressed spring more massive than a relaxed one? You bet it is. Again, we can describe this in terms of a straightforward physical effect. An already compressed spring is harder to compress further compared to a relaxed spring, but that's exactly what you have to do when you try to move it. Push the spring and it doesn't all start moving instantly. First the rear compresses a bit and then a pressure wave communicates the force to the front until the whole spring is moving. That initial push is harder for the compressed spring than for the relaxed spring. It feels like it's more massive because it is.
So the point there was you have a massless box, you have photons in it. The photons are massless particles and the whole thing should be massless. But if you accelerate it, you've got mass. Mass is an emergent property. I'll give you another example. When you heard the story about the Higgs mechanism and how it happened, well, it used to be the electromagnetic force and the weak force were combined early in the universe and they split out. Well, prior to that split, there were electroweak bosons and there were these goldstone bosons, and they were all massless. After those forces split out, they recombined and actually made very massive particles. Another example of emergent mass. Oh, too far. Okay, I'll give you another example. Let's look at the proton and the neutron. So proton, as I said, has two up quarks and a down quark. Well, the total mass, if you add up those particles, if you add up the rest masses, is about 9 million electron volts. But if you find out what the rest mass of the proton is, it's 100 times bigger. So it turns out that the percent of mass that comes from the quarks is only 1% of the total mass of the proton. Mass is coming from somewhere else. The same situation applies to neutrons. Only about 1% comes from the quarks that make up the neutron. What is giving the rest of that 99%? It's coming from the kinetic energy of the quarks. They're moving, they have kinetic energy. It's coming from the gluon binding energy that's holding the quarks to each other. And it's coming from quantum effects where you get gluons coming in and out of existence. And then there's a small one from what's called the residual nuclear force. Here's an example of emergence of volume. So if you look at an atom, Rutherford, you've had this in high school or college, maybe both, the Rutherford model of an atom where you've got a nucleus in the center, electrons around it. Well, how much is that volume due to those pieces? Hard packed, the gold nucleon only fills 44% of the nuclear volume. The diameter of the gold nucleus is only 5/1000th of the diameter of the atom. If you look at the electrons, they're really tiny, and yet they fill this big space. It's a 10 to the 14th factor difference between their size and the volume that they occupy. So in general, atoms are much larger than the nucleus. They're anywhere from 100 times to 145,000 times the mass, the volume of the nucleus. All right, and now I wanted to talk a bit about one of the mechanisms that has been proposed for birth of the universe, and I'm going to shoot it down. But what you need to know is empty space is not empty. Particles are appearing and disappearing all the time. And that's because there's this thing called a vacuum expectation value. So the completely empty space still has energy in it. And you can borrow that energy to do things with it. So you can borrow large amounts of energy for a short period of time, or you can borrow a small amount of energy for a longer period of time. And that's used to bring these particles into existence. And then the particles have to pay it back and say annihilate, and that energy goes back into the vacuum expectation value. And I'll show you how we know that is, but in the upper left is an example of a gluon field where the gluons are coming and going all the time. In the center shows a pair of quarks moving apart. And so, as I said, the gluons tie those quarks together. And in the standard model, what happens is the gluons are like stretching a rubber band. You can get them so far and then it comes back. It takes more and more energy to stretch it. If you stretch it hard enough, you break the rubber band, and you actually have so much energy in that at that point that it creates a new quark pair. And then on the right is showing a proton over here with the red, green, and blue quarks, and it's being probed by a photon. Well, I'm sorry, being probed by an electron, and electrons are going to communicate with those particles by way of the force carrier, which is the photon. And over here is a meson, which is actually, instead of being made of two quarks, is made of two quarks, a quark and an antiquark. But these vacuum expectation value is actually observable. You can take two plates and space them very, very close together. And because particles are being created in this space outside the plates and in the space within it, this space becomes so small that you can create more particles outside than inside. And there's a force pushing the plates together. And you can actually measure that. You can do it other ways too. So there are very fine microelectronics now that will do it using these little comb actuators. It's an enormous force. So if you separate these plates by 10 nanometers, which is about 10 million times the distance between protons, the force would be equal to 1 atmosphere pressure. So that's a big force. Okay, let's talk a bit about string theories. So string theories posit that particles are built from dimensional strings, and that there are standing waves on those strings, and those vibrations determine the properties of the particle, like mass. Current string theories require extra compacted dimensions. No strong argument exists for choosing from the nearly infinite number of ways that you can compact those dimensions. There's over 10 to the 500-fold ways you can do it. And there's no way pointing us to what you would pick. String theory that you hear with 11-dimensional spacetime is actually a supersymmetry model So it requires that for every particle, there be a field for each and every single, I'm sorry, not a field, but a boson for each and every particle. Without supersymmetry, you actually need a whopping 26 physical dimensions to make string theory work. We can test how many dimensions we have in the universe. So the inverse square law, things fall off with the square, energy falls off with the square of distance, right? If your dimensions are 3, you get the inverse square law. If there are any other number, it doesn't work. 3 dimensions. So that means that if there are additional dimensions, they have to be compacted to a very small space to not mess with that inverse square law. So the problem with string theories is that presently there's no evidence for extra dimensions. And there's no mechanism by which you would compact those, no mechanism by which you would compact those dimensions. There's no evidence for supersymmetry particles. In fact, collider experiments have all but ruled out supersymmetry. So simplified string theory seems to be needed. We need to get away from all these extra dimensions. So do string theories really apply to space, time, and gravity? Well, here's one way you could do it, keeping with compacted dimensions. If you had 3D space and you had 3 units of that and stuck them on a string, that'd be 10 dimensions, time makes 11. And you could have residual bonding between the dimensions, holding it all together. And you could pop out one of these as a 3-dimensional preon and leave the rest, which now have residual bonding energy, which would form associations with their neighbors. Kind of works. Still requires compacted dimensions, though. In fact, there's a theory called loop quantum gravity, one of the loop quantum gravity models that looks just like this. So here are these rings that are 2D areas of space like that, and that at the nodes are 3D volumes of space. And those are connected together. So in loop quantum gravity, time ticks in quanta because space is actually granular. And so it would move, it would tick at Planck time, which is the time it would take light to travel a Planck distance. And that turns out to be about 10 to the minus 43rd or 10 to the minus 44th of a second. We see time as nice and smooth because it's being averaged out across all these motions going on around us everywhere. So time would be quantized and it would be equivalent to movements in this spin network. And distortion of this network, distortion of space-time, would be gravity. And the spin network evolving over time is something called a spin foam. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So that kind of works, but we're still dealing with compacted dimensions. The pros of that are we got a preon out of it, and we got a spin network out of it. The cons are that the preon has this weird structure. It's asymmetric. There's no evidence for the extra dimensions, no extra for evidence for compacted dimensions, no evidence for supersymmetry. So does quantized space really require compacted dimensions? Well, here's an alternative to what's up at the top, where we've replaced the 3D space with the preon itself. So it's got 3 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and the string in the middle makes the 10th. So we're back to having 10 dimensions, but we are building with things that are 3-dimensional. And then escape of one of these preons by either quantum tunneling or bond exchange would free up a preon and would create this spin network. So that's one way of doing it. But there's another way. You can use spinor networks and avoid 10D space altogether. The way that works is that there's a physicist, Ash Qatar, who converted general relativity to what are called spin connections between these spinors that I've shown you. And that ends up looking like quantum gravity. And another group of physicists turned those connectors into closed loops and realized with that you could build conformable space. It would take on any shape you want. So here's our spin network. And then as it evolves over time, that's a spin foam. So interactions with the spin foam become quantum ticks of time. And so here's a animation to try and show you what that looks like. Okay, so closed loop strings could construct space, the electromagnetic field, and particles. So we'd start out with a string, make our bispinner, make space from that. And from this string, we would make the preons and we would build our particles. The spinners have half spin. Their wave function is half. That's actually important because it means you can't superimpose two fermions. It's why you don't fall through the floor. That's very different than the bosons. The bosons actually like to be superimposed, and you can add one on top of another. But for fermions, you can't do it. So these spinners are going to stay as independent units. You can never force them together. And I showed you that spinners have chirality. So let's label the faces. It has two distinct faces. Let's call one plus and one minus. Nobody can tell you what charge is, but I think this is what charge is. It's the chirality on the spinner. And so you do that, and what is that? That's an electric field. Now the spinners, the preons themselves, each arm is a third of the closed loop. That's going to be important. We're going to actually do something with those measurements. So why is the preon asymmetric? It was picked to have that shape so that we could build a 3D universe out of it. But you know, wouldn't nature prefer a symmetric structure? Wouldn't you really expect the preon to look like a jumping jack? Well, if you try and use a jumping jack, it can build in all directions and you end up with these very bizarre assemblies. So that's not it. So why this structure? Is it just that it's a common folding? So you start out with a circle and the first thing you do is fold it in two. Second thing you do is fold it in three. Well, no, because I can fold something that's more symmetric. I can set all of the dimensions off 120 degrees from each other. That's a symmetric structure, and that's not what we're using. So that doesn't work. It also doesn't seem like there's some sort of a template or mold for making these, because the things that we're going to build out of 2, 3, and 4 preons have different degrees of rotation to them, different degrees of freedom. So that seems unlikely. So what could set the preon configuration? Well, what I'd like to propose to you is that it's a mathematical point. A point can be represented as the intersection of 3 axes. And that's actually, when you look at it, 8 preons. Now, interestingly, these axes, plus and minus, balance out. So when you look at a mathematical point, what have you got? You got a nothing. But you can also look at it as a collection of preons. And if we can put those preons together, all of a sudden we've got something. So this just shows the jumping jack. And these are the upper quadrant preons, and these are the lower quadrant preons that we could get. So one of these points, if it came apart, could give us 8 building blocks. So it suggests that what happened in the Big Bang is that you have a field of points. It's at 0 entropy. It's completely uniform. There are no interactions between them. And then one way or another, one of these preons comes off. Maybe it's due to quantum tunneling. Maybe it's due to bond rearrangements. And when that happens, the rest of the preons cascade free. And they're going to perturb their neighbors. And so more of the neighbor points are going to pop, and that's going to expand. And what I'm proposing to you is that's the Big Bang. It's a phase transition. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, but in college, one of the things we did was we made super cooled water. You take a glass beaker, put water in it, everything's very purified, so nothing else in it, just water in a very clean beaker. You can lower its temperature down below freezing and it stays water. Then you go in with a little glass rod and you etch the glass against the beaker, and that gives a nucleation site. And just like that, you have a phase transformation. You go from liquid to solid just immediately. And that's what I'm proposing happens here. You've gone from a phase that was all points to a phase that's now liberated preons. So, I wanted to cover some interesting topics here by the end, and that would be dark energy and dark matter. So I'm kind of sneaking this stuff in. So does point popping explain dark energy? What is dark energy? Dark energy constitutes 70% of the contents of the universe. It's needed to account for the universe's expansion. Think of dark energy as a negative pressure that's resisting gravity. The space between gravitational objects is increasing. That's what you see when you use your telescopes. Everything's moving away from each other. Space within gravitationally bound objects is not increasing. So you cannot blame the increase of space on your waistline, for your waistline. Earth and the sun, the whole solar system, they're gravitationally locked. Okay, there's not space increasing between them. It appears that space only increases between objects that are not gravitationally tied to each other. So that leaves two possibilities. One is that space is not a fabric. Space is not made of anything, and therefore expansion of the universe does not involve creating any space. Objects are not gravitationally attracted are simply pushed further apart by this mysterious force called dark energy. The other possibility is space actually is a fabric, and it can be created when the local energy density is low. So low density does not exist in space containing gravitationally bound objects, so you won't create space there. The universe maintains an energy density by creating space. And the second hypothesis requires the ratio of negative pressure to energy density being -1. And that does in fact appear to be the case. And the happy news from that for you is that the universe will grow forever and it will maintain its energy density. Dream model is consistent with the presence of dark energy and with the maintenance of a minimum energy density. At the origin of the universe, entropy would have been 0, and energy density would also have been 0 or close to 0. It might be a little bit above if you allow for some quantum fluctuations. Prior to disruption of points, there was no space-time. Thus, low energy density seems to be conducive for strings escaping from points. Very low density, there's some push towards popping these points. As space expands, the energy density drops until it can support the further release of closed loops. The closed loops produce the fabric of space in keeping with the loop quantum gravity model. And the new space provides more volume within which energy density can drop as momentum thins out space. Consequently, the rate of expansion in the universe will increase exponentially. And that's what we observe. In loop quantum gravity, the distortion of space-time is gravity. Matter distorts space. So gravitationally attracted objects are never in very flat space. The presence of the matter creates a relatively high energy density state, which precludes these local expansions. So in summary, As space expands, the energy density drops, space flattens until it can support the release of strings. The process stops when loop quantum gravity deformation removes the extreme flatness. Gravity and dark energy oppose one another. I want to mention a little bit about black holes, because if you think about it, a black hole is kind of the reverse of the birth of the universe. There, all the matter is going into this black hole. So, and the theory leads to a problem that says that everything should crush to infinite density, and you get this thing called a singularity, where the math just breaks down. But it does sound like the reverse of creating a universe. But a black hole has gained mass, arguing that a true point does not form. And black holes also appear to fail to preserve information. And for these reasons, the nature of a black hole has been called into question. I know you've all seen images of black holes, but one of the proposals, the one that I like a lot, is that they're actually fuzzballs. Fuzzball is this theory developed by Mather, and what it proposes is that at a black hole, matter is broken down to its strings. Because a string is a closed loop, you can't collapse it down to a singularity. So it avoids the crisis of having your physics fail, of having a singularity fail. It also manages to preserve information that goes into a black hole by connecting the strings. And so in the fuzzball, that would be the opposite of the origin of the universe, but it would mean that the universe, if it really is the opposite of creation of the universe, it means that the universe began with strings. Okay, now the interior of the fuzzball is not part of the universe. And if that's true, so there's this event horizon and the strings all accumulate there. The inside doesn't have anything. So if that's true, then another corollary of all this is that there's some fine structure, matter or energy that defines normal space-time. And note that since a black hole only has mass and angular momentum, it actually meets the definition for a type of dark matter. And since fuzzball theory is equating strings with dark matter, that says if you want to find out what dark matter is, look to the strings. Okay, it looks like I am over time. If you can bear with me for a little bit more, I can show you how this model works with these preons. So the proposal is that the preons interact by wave interference. So if you have waves that are in phase, they will constructively interfere and give you a wave of higher amplitude. And so that would add up to making a bond. If they are out of phase, they destructively interfere, and that could actually be a way of breaking a bond. And so now we're going to start building things with these. We take our string, we make our preon. If you stick two of them together, you get the photon. If you put three of them together, you get gluons. Okay, so why do I say that the photon is this two preon assembly? For a couple reasons. One is that it's the first particle assembled, and consequently it should be abundant, which photons are. Not a particularly strong argument. It lacks a spinner. Has no squares, no spinner associated with this. So it should be massless, and it's not going to be a fermion. So we've already thrown out most of the particles. A 360-degree rotation returns this to its start. So it should be a boson. And because it has zero charge, this thing actually turns out to be its own antiparticle. And there are very few things that meet that criteria. Photon is one of them. And this bond gives it a degree of freedom to rotate. Now, there's this model by Oglesby that proposed that a photon is actually two monocharges rotating relative to each other. So remember that if you move a charge, you get an electromagnetic field. And so he came up with this complicated rotation scheme. But if we say that this L-shaped piece is a monocharge, then we've got two monocharges rotating relative to each other. The frequency of light would depend on how fast they're rotating relative to each other, but it would produce an electromagnetic wave. Colors, so the quarks are held together by gluons, and the gluons have this property called color charge. So in the standard model, there are three color charges, and the reason for three is both measurement, experimental measurement, and also that if you're trying to put three quarks together to make a proton or a neutron, each of those units needs to have different quantum values. Pauli exclusion principle will prohibit you from sticking two things with the same quantum values together if they're fermions. So they had to add something to the quarks to make it all assemble. And that was the color charge. So there's red, green, and blue, and anti-red, anti-green, and anti-blue. And with those, you can build these combinations that they call gluons. And this is a little model of how the standard model proposes that this works, is that the quarks are passing these gluons between them. They're taking color away from the gluon that they're leaving, from the quark that they're leaving, and they're adding color to the quark that they arrive at. I don't believe that model's right. When we put the three preons together, we get these structures. And they are the right number to give us the colors. So we've got red, green, and blue, and then there's another one. And that's usually ignored in the standard model, but there is this gluon that's called white because everything balances out on it. These are not actual colors. Okay. They were given this name because protons and neutrons do not have a color charge. So if they've got three, if the quarks each have a color charge, those need to balance out to white. And so they gave them red, green, and blue because red, green, and blue balance out to white. So it's an analogy. But in the dream model, we actually get 3.5 colors because here's our three color pairs. This one and this one, although they're mirror images here, are actually the same structure. It's its own antiparticle. So if you take this and you turn it around, you'll see that you have the same structure as over here. So in the dream model, we have 3.5 colors. Note that if you rotate the L-shaped piece on these, so if we turn this red one 90 degrees, we'd have the green color. And if we rotate that one, we'd have the blue color. And if we rotate that, we'd have the white color. And same thing happens for the anti-colors. So this could explain why there's color change between the quarks. Also, in the photon, the L-shaped pieces are supposed to be monocharges that were rotating relative to each other. So these would be monocharges. Charges attract. These are opposite charges. They should attract. So we can pair these up now using this top part. And interestingly enough, this bottom part is just what you need to bind to a quark. So what's the evidence for three colors? Sorry, actual data here. So it turns out that electron-positron collisions can give us that answer. So when they collide, you can produce muons, which are charge 1, and they don't have the color charge. Or they can produce quarks, which do have the color charge. And those then change into these things called hadrons that we can pick up in our accelerators. And so they look at this ratio. And what it means is that you are taking a ratio to charges. Since the muons are 1, they drop out. And so you've got the square of each charge. So the down quark is a charge of minus a third. So take minus a third, square it, you get a ninth. Up quark is 2/3, square it, you get 4/9. So you add these up and then you multiply it by the number of colors and look for the value. And it comes out 3.7. Here's the actual data for the charge ratios that you see. So they said, okay, that's pretty good. 3 colors. Frankly, I don't think that's very good. And remember that the dream model proposes 3.5 colors. So let's test that. So if we multiply by 3.5 instead of 3, we come out at 4.28. And we're not doing so good either. We're up above instead of down below. So at this point, we're black and blue, not at all good. But this is weird because to me, it looks like they glossed over something. And that's that this is not linear. This is curvilinear. It's low on this side and curving up on this side. So they picked that this was for 5 quarks based on the energies that they were using. But it might not be 5 quarks. If you don't have direct head-on collisions, you lose some of the energy of the collision. You might not be producing 5 quarks. You might be producing 4. And on the far side, you could still be trying to get to 6. So let's see where that leads us. So if we say, okay, there weren't 5 quarks, there were 4, and use the standard model, then we get the red line, which is a very poor fit to the data. If we do that with 3.5 colors, it's great. Here's the line, goes through most of the data. And then over on the right side, the data starts to pull away. 3.5 looks pretty good. Okay, well, okay, maybe we got 5 quarks out to here, and then we're starting to head up towards enough energy to get to 6 quarks. So a head-on collision will give us some particles, but otherwise it doesn't produce them. So if we look at 6 quarks and 3 colors, the standard model, we would be way up here. We've already got points above it. Does not look very good for the standard model. If we look at the dream model with 3.5 colors, we're up here and it looks like the points are rising up to it. Now, what we need more data. We need higher energy experiments to see if this plateaus or not. Wrap it up. Okay. So what I'm going to do is show you next time how do we assign these particles that we create to particular fermions, to the up quark versus the down quark versus the electron or electron neutrino. How do we decide which ones are the fermions and which ones are the bosons? So unfortunately, I'm out of time today. So I'll show you that next time, along with the secret to what's dark matter. It turns out that the model proposes one candidate, and it appears at exactly down to the decimal point, the ratio at which dark to normal matter is observed in the universe. So I hope to convince you of what the identity of dark matter is. So a real cliffhanger for you. Oh, and hang on to your sheets here, these little handouts. You're going to need them for next week as well.
All right. So for those of you who are new to Oasis or haven't been in a while, we haven't been doing community moments every week, but community moment is a chance for someone from the community to come up, give a short little talk, maybe something they've read, something they're interested in, and share with the community. So this week's community moment will be given by Lou Kana. So please help me welcome Lou up to the front.
Hey, good morning, everybody. You hear me okay? The subject of homeopathic medicine has come up at Oasis before. What got me interested in this subject was an article I read in Skeptical Inquirer magazine. This is the product of CFI, and they're kind of friends of ours and vice versa. So, homeopathy is a medical system based on the belief that the body can cure itself. Those who practice it use tiny amounts of natural substances like plants and minerals. Thank you. Plants and minerals. They believe these stimulate the healing process. We'll see. There is no good quality evidence that homeopathy is an effective treatment for any health conditions. Some practitioners also claim that homeopathy can prevent malaria or other diseases. It can't. There is no evidence to support this and no scientifically plausible way that homeopathy can prevent diseases. A 2010 House of Commons Science and Technology Committee report on homeopathy said that homeopathic remedies perform no better than placebos, and that the principles on which homeopathy is based are scientifically implausible. Homeopathic products are regulated as drugs under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. You know them as the FDA, and are subject to the same requirements related to approval, adulteration, and misbranding as other drug products. There are currently no homeopathic products approved by the FDA. Homeopathic remedies are generally safe. The risk of a serious adverse side effect from taking these remedies is thought to be small. Some homeopathic remedies may contain substances that are not safe or that interfere with the action of other medicines. You should talk to your GP, your general practitioner, before stopping any treatment prescribed by a homeopathic doctor or avoiding procedures such as vaccination in favor of homeopathy. I've talked to 3 doctors, my general practitioner, and 2 doctors who are active in this community. They all pretty much the same thing. If it doesn't do any harm, okay, but you shouldn't use homeopathic products in replace of something that's a proven product. So, homeopathic medicines are therapeutically active microdoses of mineral, botanical, and biological substances used to treat various health conditions, including allergies, coughs, colds, flu, muscle pain, occasional sleeplessness, anxiousness, nervous tension, and stress. You might see an improvement in your condition within a few weeks of starting homeopathic treatment. On the other hand, it might even take a few years to see positive results. I don't think anybody's going to wait a couple of years. The Center for back to the article. The Center for Inquiry, or CFI, has filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against Boiron, that's Boiron Incorporated, the largest manufacturer of homeopathic products in the world. Boiron knows its products are worthless junk, so they do everything they can to obscure the truth. CFI is also suing Walgreens. And based on a conversation I had with a pharmacist at CVS, they may be next. If you go to the Boiron website, there is a product called Saccharum officinalis, supposedly relieves nervous agitation in children. Its sole active ingredient is table sugar. Another company is Stella Life. They make homeopathic products that are supposed to relieve pain and swelling after gum and dental surgery. There is no scientific evidence that these products work. Another company is New Chapter, and it's kind of interesting. If you go to their website, it'll take you a while to find the fine print that their products are all homeopathic. It's almost as though they're hiding it. Okay. Now, I have a cousin, pretty smart guy named Steve, lives in Austin, a retired manufacturer engineer. And he swears by a product by Boiron called Arnica, Arnica. It's a pain relief gel. He swears it works. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying that in most cases, homeopathic products are placebos, and if they work, it's because you think they're going to work. So talked to a CVS pharmacist, she said, and I asked her about the homeopathic products on their shelves. And she said, yeah, I tried to get a commitment out of her, but I couldn't. She said, you can use it if you want to. She works for CVS. What is she going to say, right? Okay, so the bottom line, if the product seems to be working, continue to take it, but not to the exclusion of more proven products. Thank you.
And I have a couple of announcements here. We have a bicycle ride coming up on Saturday, January 21st, Eleanor Tinsley Park. We're going to determine the time depending on weather. Contact Ted if you have more questions on this, or Richard. We have a donation thing in the back for, we accept cash and cashless payments too. Next week, we're going to have part 2 of the talk by Eric, and we're going to have music by Ryan Bitter. And hope you all have a rest of the week. Good rest of the week. Thank you.
I'll be leaving in the morning, westward bound, I'm sure you know. There ain't much time left for talking, so honey, do you want to go? Some say the highway is for gamblers. Let's roll those dice one more time. This road, it won't go on forever, but it might just last a good long ride. So don't look back, it's just a pocket full of roses. Don't look back, it's just a fistful of thorns. Don't look back, broken hearts will all be mended. Don't look back, broken spirits be reborn. Now there's no chance in taking chances. There's no dream that can't be dreamed. In a world so unexpected, won't you take a chance on me? 'Cause we've seen enough to know better. Thrown all caution to the wind. We've tasted sweet wine and bitter fruit. Lost enough times to know what it really means to win. So don't look back. It's just a pocket full of roses. Don't look back. It's just a fistful of thorns. Don't look back. Broken hearts will all be mended. Don't look back. Broken spirits be reborn. I'll be leaving in the morning. Westward bound, I'm sure you know. There ain't much time left talking. So honey, do you wanna go? Don't look back. It's just a pocket full of roses. Don't look back. It's just a fistful of thorns. Don't look back. Broken hearts will all be mended. Don't look back. Broken spirits be reborn.